What's up and welcome to My Point of View. I am your fat and opinionated host, and one thing that I've noticed happens really often in these cases is that we make the mistake of assuming that these criminals are smarter than what they really are. And I'm not saying that just other people do that. I'm guilty of that as well. One case I always look back on is the Bryan Laundrie Gabby Petito case. Everyone thought that Bryan Laundrie was this mastermind expert at living off of the grid, that he was a professional at eluding law enforcement. Bryan must be in South America. Bryan's in Mexico. Bryan's going to live in the Appalachian Mountains for the rest of his life. No, Bryan's in Canada. No, Bryan is on a boathouse. There was so many theories out there, and everyone assumed that Bryan was smarter than what he really was, because it turned out that Bryan just offed himself a few miles away from home, and his body was laying right there where law enforcement was searching for weeks. So when looking at this Idaho 4 case and looking at Bryan Kohberger, I don't want to make that same mistake. Now, of course, what everyone is talking about, including myself, is what Bryan was going to school for. Bryan seemed to be interested in how the criminal minds work. We know that Bryan was attending classes, he was going to college, studying how the criminal minds work. And as we've been going over these details, I think a lot of people, including myself, thought or assumed that Bryan must be pretty smart. That Bryan must know a lot about how the criminal mind works. At least he's smarter than the average. But then I got to thinking about Bryan Laundrie, and I was sitting there like, you know what? I don't want to assume too much, because this guy could just be an idiot. He could be an ex-junkie that really wanted to freaking do something crazy, so he enrolled in college and took these classes and barely skimmed by just because he was a freak that wanted to pull off something weird, and maybe he thought he would get away with it, or maybe just learning about this stuff got him off. Well, we now have the answer to this question. Is Bryan really smart or not? Well, according to one of his teachers, Bryan was one of the best students that she ever had. And she is shocked as ish about what he's being accused of. She says that in her 10 years of teaching, that she's only recommended 2 students to a PhD program, and Bryan was one of them. Now, I know that we've talked a lot about how Bryan was attending school and that Bryan was a student, but Bryan was also a teacher. Bryan was also teaching young kids, or I guess people around his age, about how the criminal mind worked as well. The New York Times actually spoke with a handful of Bryan Kohberger's former classmates and colleagues while he attended DeSales University and Washington State University, pursuing degrees in criminology. By most accounts, he was deeply entrenched in his major, but to a point that it was off-putting and sometimes combative, which reportedly led to conflicts in his life. There are 2 specific anecdotes that paint a picture of the type of person Kohberger was in academia, both of which happened at Washington State University. In one instance, a former classmate of his tells the Times that Kohberger got into a heated discussion with another fellow PhD student about a criminology concept and was accused of mansplaining to the woman. She got so upset over the conversation that she left the class, leaving behind her own personal items. Kohberger was also a teacher's assistant at Washington State University, but a student who was in one of the classes he helped teach says he avoided eye contact with them all and was supposedly a harsh grader, leaving extensive notes on their papers. It got so bad, the students began to complain en masse. The student also claims that later in the fall, around the time of the Idaho incident, Kohberger loosened up on grading and stopped leaving notes on their papers altogether. There are other accounts of Bryan being highly engaged in discussions about criminology. And also noted is that Bryan was under the tutelage of professors who focused on serial killers and gruesome crimes. So, I guess that clears up some of my questions about Bryan. Make no mistake about it, Bryan may have gotten caught. Bryan did something stupid. Bryan did something evil. But Bryan wasn't just your run-of-the-mill student. From what this teacher says, Bryan was the best, brightest, smartest student she's ever had. So that tells you how seriously Bryan took his education. And to think that Bryan took his education so seriously, but didn't necessarily have any plans for himself in the future. I guess maybe Bryan thought that he was so smart that he would never be caught. But in my mind, why are you so dedicated to your education if ultimately your plan or your goal is to do something like what Bryan did? Did Bryan seek out this education because he wanted to educate himself to become a better criminal? Or did Bryan think that, hey, maybe he would have a normal future where he would have a successful career in this line of work? But seeing that Bryan had a specific obsession, a specific interest about serial killers and crime scenes, I've read through so many accounts of people who knew Bryan. Some I haven't even talked about on YouTube yet. But I've read another account where they pulled up a crime scene in one of the classrooms. And Bryan immediately hopped up and had so many theories and so many thoughts about how someone could escape that crime scene, or how the crime could have taken place. So Bryan did a lot of thinking about crimes and how to get away with crimes. And that is just so utterly bizarre, scary, and crazy. The more I think about it, the more chills it sends down my spine. Knowing that there's someone out there getting a college education to make themselves a better criminal. That's like the exact opposite of what college is for. You send your kids off so they can become successful adults, and they come back home murderers. They come back home hating America. They come back home, indoctrinated with all types of far out there beliefs. It's like, at this point, just homeschool your kids and forget college, okay? College is just not a good place for anyone. Now, obviously, I'm kind of joking about that, but I'm not really joking about that. College has gotten crazy, but I'm glad that we got this piece of information, because I was really wondering, how seriously did Bryan take his education? Was this just something that he was doing? Or because, I don't know, it's so weird, because when you think of someone who's dedicated in college, they're dedicated to their classrooms, they're the best student, you think of someone who's really focused on their future. And how much of a future do you really have if you're out here killing random people? I don't know if I'm struggling for a way to put this, because I do feel like Bryan had these urges, But I wonder how long, like when Bryan got into college, did he know that he was trying to do something like this? Did he know that his future would be him trying to get away with these crimes? Or did throughout his education, did he become more obsessed? You know what I mean? My question is this. This is the best way I can word it. Did Bryan know that he had these dark thoughts and feelings? Did Bryan know that he wanted to take someone's life So he went into this field of education so he could become a better criminal, so one day he could take someone's life and hopefully get away with it? Or did Bryan get into this education field and then become obsessed with his education, become so obsessed with what he was learning that he had to commit a crime himself? Or did he become so obsessed that he thought he was so smart that he could do it himself? Did he need that extra bit of hands-on education? You know what I mean? At really attempting to do something like the crimes he's seen throughout his education. That's the questions I have. What do you think? Which one do you think it is? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're down there, hit the thumbs up, hit the subscribe, ring the notification bell, and always remember to remain opinionated.